Hi everyone and welcome to taking measurements for a dress or a tunic. This is the same for an under tunic or a regular tunic, so it doesn't matter which you're doing for this. First thing I always do is write down the measurements I'm going to take. I like to get this prepped beforehand so I know I'm not going to forget anything. The details of what measurements you need to take are in the comments below. Okay, so we're going to start measuring now. Okay, so the first measurement I'm going to take is the shoulders. I have to admit, I always measure in inches because I find it easier to add the seam allowance in that. So, you need to make sure your person is standing up straight and tall. So can you face me? Right. When you're measuring the shoulders, you want the seams to sit straight on the top of the shoulders. So you're judging the distance. So on her, this is 16 inches. I'm not going further out to where her arms end. I'm literally going to the line where her shoulders end. This is often useful to look at the seams of the t-shirt if that's what they're wearing. Okay, so I've got 16 inches and I'm writing them down as I go. I'm then going to measure the bust. It doesn't matter whether it's a guy or a girl, we still call it a bust, it's around the same place. They need to put out their arms. And again, they're not puffing out, they're not stretching. So we're going round. Okay, so it's 35 on her. I want it not to be pulled tight, not to be too loose. And I'm checking that it's where the bra line would be and the tape measure's not twisted, so that's 35. Okay, we measure the waist. We don't actually need the waist for making the dress or tunic, but what you want to do is check that that waist measurement isn't bigger than the bust, because otherwise you need to make the bust measurement for the tunic to fit. So if it's not bigger, I sometimes don't even bother to write it down. So it is 28, not bigger. I'll write it down, but I'll put a cross through it. I'm not really bothered by it. Okay, we then measure the bicep. You want them to choose whichever arm they think is strongest and really make the pose. This is to check there will be enough room in the arms. Okay, we're on 11. Next, we're measuring the forearm. So on the person, this is the widest part. So I'd count that almost is in the elbow. This is because on some people, particularly guys who've done a lot of sword work, that can be bigger than their bicep, but we're on 9 here. I'm going to measure the hand. Again, just keeping the hand fairly loose. We don't need to do anything dramatic. This is just to check that whatever we make our sleeve to, the hand is going to fit through. And we are on 8. That will just give me a bit of rough shaping when I'm cutting out the tunic, that I know basically the shape that the arm's going to be. Okay, so I've done all of the measurements that are going round. I now need to start going down the body. The first thing I'm going to do, I always call it shoulder to length. This is wherever you want your tunic to sit. We're making an underdress here, so it's going to go right down to the ground for Becky. If she had particularly thick shoes on, I'd ask her to take them off. If it's for a guy and you're making a tunic or for a woman fighting, check the regs each time because it shows really clearly where the line needs to go to. Okay, I'm going to ask Becky to hold with her opposite hand. If she holds with this hand, it's just going to distort it. One shoulder's going to come up. So we're relaxing loosely. I'm going all the way to the ground where it hits. That's 56. Okay, so now we're going to do the shoulder to bust, and we're doing all the internal measurements so that the tunic will sit really nicely on her body. With this, I'm going from the top of the shoulder, and I'm trying to judge where the bra line would be. Okay, this is the same on guys. So here, if you look, it's 10 on her. If you're slightly off with it though, it's not the end of the world. I'm then judging shoulder to hip. Now on girls, I have to say this is generally a bit easier. If you're unsure at all, the points where the hip should go needs to sit underneath an authentic belt. So if you're finding it hard to find their hips, have them put on a belt and you can literally measure to where the belt goes. So again, I'm holding it, I'm going down to where her hip would be. I'm going to clasp that. Oh, I've gone slightly wonky with my tape measure. If you're finding it a bit tricky and it's going wonky, turn them around and do it on the back, because sometimes that's a little bit easier. There we go. I'm going to go to 18 there with the line of her hip. Okay, last measurement I need to take is arm length. This is going to be for an under tunic, so when it's hemmed, I want it to be coming to this knuckle here. However, always just make your arms plenty long enough, because there's nothing worse than discovering your arms are too short. So I'm going to measure all the way to the end of her thumb at 25 and a half. And then I know that I've got absolutely plenty. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to calculate our seam allowance. For whatever we're making, you only ever add an inch to your shoulder measurement for your seam allowance. Otherwise, it ends up too baggy and it slides off the shoulders way too easily. So my seam allowance with it added on, my final measurements are 17 for that. All the measurements that go round the body, you need to halve so that you get the flat measurement, and then we add the seam allowance. Now, for a tunic or a dress, you add 1.5 inches. For an under tunic or underdress, because you want it to be a little bit looser, you add 2 inches to that. Okay, so now I'm going to do my bust measurement. Because I'm making an underdress, I want to add 2 inches of seam allowance. So halved 35 is 17.5. I'm adding my 2 inches, I get to 19.5. My waist I'm not worried about because it was smaller. I can fit my waist later. So I'm onto my bicep now. That is halved 5.5. I'm adding my 2 inches. I get to 7.5. Oh, let's make that really clear. So forearm halved 4.5. Adding my 2 inches of seam allowance, I'm on 6.5. So hand halved is 4. Adding my 2 inches, I get to 6. Okay, so I've done all of my around measurements. Okay, so now I'm doing my length measurements. Add plenty if you're nervous. I always add just 2 inches to my length because there's nothing worse than a short dress or tunic. So I'm adding that to 58. The next two are internal measurements. So we don't need to add any seam allowance because there aren't any seams going on in that area. So I've now got my 10, I'm going to leave the same. 18, I'm going to leave the same. Then I've got my arm length. We already measured this slightly long because it's easier to do that. So if you're nervous, add the 2 inches. I'm just going to add the 1 because I already know that's long enough. So we've got one last thing we need to do. We need to have the length of the gore. Now, rather than measuring again, I always find it easier just to take away the shoulder to hip measurement from the shoulder to length, and that will leave you with the length your gore needs to be. So I always just make a note, do the maths. Here it's going to be 32. Now, these are the measurements you are going to be making from. Do not make the mistake of then going from your measurements without seams. Okay, everyone, so there we have how to measure for a tunic or a dress. The next video shows the cutting out.